A Smith County inmate who was found guilty of escaping a transport van and burglary was sentenced. KLTV's Lauren Tier was there to hear the closing arguments and the jury's decision.
Timothy Chappelle met his fate in court.
We, the jury, upon the defendant, Timothy Chappelle, having been found guilty of escape as charged in the indictment, do hereby unanimously find the alleged prior conviction to be true and assess his punishment of confinement in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Institutional Division for a term of 20 years.
In January, a KLTV 7 viewer captured this video of Chappelle running after breaking out of a Smith County jail transport van. Sheriff Larry Smith told us the jailer driving the van was stopped at a red light when Chappelle kicked out a window to escape. After breaking out of the van, Chappelle managed to break into 2 houses along Wisteria Drive. Chappelle chose to represent himself in the trial even though he was appointed an attorney by the court. This attorney, Kurt Noel, who has worked as a lawyer for nearly 40 years.
I think the idea that you can learn probably what it takes 5 years of practice at least to know the basics, let alone any longer than that, when someone has practiced decades predominantly doing criminal law, to elect to represent yourself is a very bad decision.
Chappelle was not allowed to finish delivering his closing statement after he addressed evidence that was not relevant to what had been previously discussed in the trial.
I know based on what has happened and the plea bargaining that had occurred that he never wanted to listen to, that there would have been a better result.
After about an hour of deliberation, the jury came to their decision. Lauren Tier, KLTV 7 News.
In addition to his time in prison, he will have to pay a $10,000 fine.